But it's 1:30, so we're going to get started. Welcome to this is the final series, the final of the library series this summer. And we're not at the library because we didn't know about the road construction by the library and how that was going to get done. So we decided to come here. But thank you to the library staff and to Val for hosting this. And we're really glad you're here. I know that Kay Voigt and Bill Arndt did the first 2 months, and I'm picking up the end here. And last year, if you were here with us, we covered the 13 people that actually made the journey and their adventures, and took it right up until the time that Hutchinson was founded. And all of this is going to be a 3-year series. All of this is coming from a document that was presented to the Minnesota Historical Society in 1901 by W.W. Pendergast, who was really the reason that the Hutchinson brothers came here. And he went on to write some books, and he was kind of a mover and a shaker around here, but he was also on the state legislature. And in 1901, he made this submission to the Minnesota Historical Society, and it's named Sketches of the History of Hutchinson by the Honorable William W. Pendergast, William Wirt Pendergast. And we'll take a couple minutes and just recap how they came to be here. And then we're just going to talk about the first couple years. We're going to talk about 1855 through up to 1862. So not a very long period in our time, but that is where there were some things that were started here in town that kind of set the stage, even for who we are today. So it's pretty cool. And then next year, we're going to spend the last series from this, because most of the 28-page document talks about the actual time of the Dakota Uprising and all of those conflicts that took place and what happened here locally. And it names names and it talks about the dates, and it's really fascinating. For those of you who have been on our Historic Hutchinson tour, you know that we talk about the uprising, and we talk specifically about Little Crow, but kind of from satellite level. But we're going to talk about the trials and tribulations of some of the families that made their way to the stockade, and some of the families that tried to and didn't make it. There are some extremely sad stories that happened just right around that uprising. And that's so that's going to be next year. But this year, we're just going to talk about those early days. So in spring of 1855, W.W. Pendergast was a photographer, and he owned some other businesses in Milwaukee and Chicago, and he had dreams of being a land speculator. So at those times, there were people that were trying to get out ahead of the settlement. You know, if you showed up, they would the government would just give you that 80 acres and show you where it was. But there were people who had knowledge of that and how it was working, and they were trying to get out ahead of that. They were land speculators. They had dreams of controlling more than 80 acres. And there was some law in place in the country to protect people from that. But still, yet, there was a need for people to be able to buy that land and do their thing. So that's what we're talking about. Historic Hutchinson was founded over 26 years ago. And this is our mission statement: to restore, to preserve, and to protect the living and structural history and spirit of the Hutchinson area, to showcase these assets now and in the future. I'll bet you Hazel Zitz can repeat that back to me because she's heard that like a million times in the last 25 years.
It's still interesting.
Well, we're glad you keep coming back. The mission statement is important, and we came out of the Blandon Community Leadership Program way back in 1999 that helped us develop that. And some people wonder, how does Historic Hutchinson keep going, and why is it so successful? And it is very successful, and it's most successful because of our members and our ability to create interest in younger people So even though when you look around the room, we're all getting up there, but when you come to our meetings and the actual physical operations of Historic Hutchinson, most of those people are in their 30s and 40s that are working with our older members, and they're doing a great job. And a few of our members that are here can attest to their young leadership and their excitement. And if there's something to do, they just do it. They have great ideas. So we're really fortunate to that. This is part of the living history of our mission statement, which is really fun because we spend a lot of time on non-romantic stuff, and that is, of course, brick and mortar and raising money, and how much fun that can be. So we're going to talk about Hutchinson, Minnesota, and the big vision that they had. So in the spring of 1855, McLeod County was founded, and the settlement was in Glencoe, and W.W. Pendergast was roaming around in southeast Minnesota, down by Rochester. And he really liked what he saw down there. He commented about the good farmland and all the timber and the structure of the land because it's pretty rolly, which reminded him of home in New Hampshire and where he was in around Milwaukee. And but he kept hearing about this area that had even better farmland west of the big woods. And we've heard that, you hear that all the time. This is where the big woods meets the prairie. So it's the natural end of the savanna forest. It starts all the way on the east coast. The legend is if you're a squirrel and you try to climb a tree in the east coast, you don't have to hit the ground until you get to Hutchinson. And then you run out of trees. But if you think about it, when we go to the west and get out about Cosmos, it starts to look a lot like South Dakota. When we go to the east and we're over by St. Bonnie, it looks a lot like Wisconsin. This is the natural barrier of where that forest ends. And he heard about this land, and he knew that it was getting way too late in the year. But he thought, that is the first place I'm going to go in the spring of 1856. So he worked his way back, and on his way back, his first stop was Milwaukee. And he saw that his friends, the Hutchinson brothers, who were also originally from New Hampshire and now from Lynn, Massachusetts, were having a concert. So he took in their concert because he knew who they were. And after this big successful concert, he said, we should get together tomorrow for a visit. And they agreed, and they came calling on him the next day. And they shared with him their plans of singing across the United States and ending up in Kansas, where they would found a village, name it after themselves, in Kansas, because they were going to go and meet the ruffians. Kansas at the time was where the North was meeting the South. And they wanted to go and fight the good fight for the North and help stop the South from coming up anymore. And that was their goal. Now they were abolitionists. They were a big part of the temperance movement. They were kind of pacifists. It was interesting when you hear about them. They were a real interesting mix of conservative values and liberal values. And they were an interesting bunch. But they wouldn't shy away from poking the bear, if you would. And they would create a lot of, especially over the slavery issue and the alcohol issue, they would create a lot of dissension in the streets, if they will. And actually their concerts would even cause some riots, especially in the East Coast. So they were very interesting. And they were going down there to fight their fight. And when W.W. Pendergast heard that, he said, why don't you forego all of the poetry and the blood that you're headed for, and check out this new area, this Minnesota area where the big woods meets the prairie, where they're not fighting that fight, and found your town, and just have your own utopia. And they asked a whole bunch of questions about Minnesota, and he was able to answer them. And almost on the spot, they changed their plans, and they headed for Minnesota. And of course, Pendergast was headed back home, ending up because he had a couple of businesses to liquidate. So his cousin, Roswell Pendergast, decided to join him. Basically he just went to represent WW, because we all know that WW wanted to get his hands on a bunch of land. And he wanted to do it near a successful community. So he was connecting the dots, maybe that the Hutchinsons weren't, even though the Hutchinsons were pretty savvy politically. But this whole idea of new development was a little new to them. And so he sent his cousin Roswell, and they headed for Minneapolis. And they ended up in Minneapolis, and they ran across a young civil engineer who really, even though they hadn't met, had the same ideas as W.W. Pendergast. He was a civil engineer, he was a scholar, and he was a young, sharp dude, and his name was Lewis Harrington. And he joined their party because he saw opportunity, and he heard about where they were headed. And he joined their party, along with some other people that we talked about last year, some ruffians that were just grunts, and some musicians, and a couple of business people. It was a very fascinating mixture. And they worked their way out, and on November 19th of 1855, they ended up on the hill, pretty much almost exactly where the Harrington Merrill House is. And we know that by his description here, because he makes reference to the hill that they landed on. He makes reference to that in 1901 when he's telling the story. And they ended up on a hill where, just up the hill from where the Catholic parsonage is now. And that in 1901 was right where the Catholic Church was before it was converted to an apartment building. That's where the Catholic parsonage was. So right below the hill where the Harrington Merrill House is. And they made camp on top of that hill. So that's where today's presentation starts, because they had big, exciting things. So they sung the song, they sung the Star Spangled Banner to their fiddles, and they declared on the 19th of November that it was the most beautiful place that they had ever seen. And the next day, they decided to meet in Colonel Stevens' tent, and then the following day, they traveled back down to Glencoe, and they sat down and they started to work on their corporate structure. And they came up with 13 articles of incorporation. They would have the Twin Cities, Hutchinson and Harmony. Now the reason for that is, at that time there was a statute, I think it was a federal statute, that new towns could only be 320 acres. The reason that they did that was just for the reason of people like W.W. Pendergast. They didn't want someone coming in and saying, well, this is our town, and it's 1,000 acres. And it starts as this teeny little town in the middle, but then maybe one or two people would control all that land for decades and decades and decades, and kind of hold the people hostage. Well, the Hutchinsons had big ideas, so they founded their Twin Cities. And their Twin Cities split right out here on Washington Avenue. It goes up in front of the theater. And everything to the south of Washington Avenue was Hutchinson, and everything to the north was Harmony, Minnesota, because they were musicians. So our original streets were all named after musical terms, composers. We had a Handel Street. We still have a Harmony Lane. We have a Lynn Road because originally they were from Lynn, Massachusetts. We still have a Lincoln Avenue and Franklin. So they would name streets after people that they had a lot of respect for. So some of them survived, some of them didn't. Of course, then we got real creative and we renamed all our streets first, second, third. One possible future project for Historic Hutchinson, and you may have been in towns where they've done this, is they take the original street names and they put them on a brown street sign, put them underneath the existing street signs to remind everybody what the old names were, which would really be cool. Maybe we'll do that someday. So one of the articles was they were hiring Harrington to lay out the towns, and they paid him $380 to do that. But there was 100 shares total. 10 shares went to each of the Hutchinsons. There were 3 of them. and 5 shares went to each of the 11. So of the 11 others, 15 others to be determined by the Hutchinsons themselves. So they held 15 shares. I don't know how this works. Don, maybe you could give us a class on that sometime. That's how it is. The river shall continue to be called by its Indian name, Hassan, which, and we've seen 2 interpretations. In this interpretation, it says it means leaf. In another interpretation, we've seen that it means maple leaf. Okay. And L. Harrington and R.H. Pendergast, okay, so the first cousin, he's right there, and Henry Chambers were all appointed to do the business of the company and dispose the lots to the settlers. So when the settlers would show up, if they didn't want to go out and settle a piece of land, maybe they had a store or some kind of interesting craft, then they would buy lots from the folks. And then there would be special meetings by written request of 3 of the members, and then there would be a special meeting. Okay, so it was pretty, they did a pretty good job. Shareholders neglecting to pay their authorized assessment shall forfeit their stock. And it was voted to employ Harrington for $380, and they set aside 15 acres, which would later be changed to 22 acres for a park. Okay, so that's really interesting. That is North Park. And then they set aside 5 acres on the corner there for the Humanities Church. And then, they set, I missed one, they set 8 building lots aside right there also for education. So public education, a church, and a park, all in one area, all publicly owned. How would that go over today? Oh, holy smokes, that would be horrible. And that's how that whole area evolved. And then also that there would be equal rights for Hutchinson women. Hutchinson women would have equal rights with Hutchinson men. And that we look at that today and go, oh, big deal. Well, it was a big deal. Think about it. It's 1855. And women didn't get the right to vote until, 1907, 1908? So they were 40-some years, almost 40-some years ahead of their time. And that there would be no saloons, bowling alleys, or billiard halls, billiard rooms. And we know that lasted about 10 minutes. Because one of the first owners of a saloon or a billiard hall with alcohol was W.W. Pendergast. But it had a storefront, and they were very public about what it was, but they also had a storefront that it was something else. And there was a business in there running, and then a saloon and billiard in the back. So at least it wasn't right out in their face, but it did exist. I thought that was interesting, how he explains it. And then the next morning, the party returns to Minneapolis. And they return to Minneapolis, and I suppose they're doing work of how the city's going to work. But during the winter of 1855, Messrs. Harrington and Bell surveyed the township. And Harrington took the lead. He did most of the work, even though the contract was awarded to both Harrington and Bell. Now, Bell was a local surveyor, and he was with the party that founded the county. And he is really the one who said, you got to come here, because it's pretty cool. Where the Hassan River bends to the west. I'll pass this around. This is what they came up with that winter. And our town still just looks like it. And they have everything on there, including Park Square, which evolves into Library Square over the years. And so that's what happens. And then in 1856, W.W. Pendergast comes back. And that is a fascinating story about his trip back. Because there's still nothing going on here. There's still no infrastructure. And he tells the tales of just interesting little things that people are starting to catch on to. So for example, they end up down a little further south. When the Hutchinsons came, they crossed at Carver, and they crossed the river at Carver, and then they came up from Norwood and straight over to, Glenville, and then north, always following the waterway. But he ended up a little farther south. I can't exactly remember where it was. But he tells this story about how him and a couple of guys that are traveling with him see that there is a steamer, a little steamboat that is on the river that they're going to take up part way. And it's all stoked up. And there's smoke coming out of the smokestack. And they're ringing the bell. And they're telling people, come run. So we went running and we bought our ticket. And we settled in. And then the smoke quit. And we sat there. And then about an hour or so later, they fired it up. And the smoke. And they rang the bell. And more people came running. And they actually didn't leave until they filled the boat up. But they did that to trick people to say, I better get on here, I better get my ticket. So they sat there for hours until the boat was full. And then they took it up. So I thought that was interesting. He also tells about a story, and I think it was probably either Swan Lake or Silver Lake. Probably Swan Lake. So anyway, they're hungry. They were kind of run out of food, and then they're hoping to get to Hutchinson where there's some supplies, where they think there's some supplies. And somebody shoots a goose, and the goose doesn't go down right away, and it circles all around, and it goes down right in the middle of Swan Lake. And so they're hungry, so W.W. Pendergast swims out to get the goose. And it was quite an ordeal, because they didn't know how deep it was or anything like that. So when he got back, one of the people that were traveling with him had built a fire, and one of the little boys felt bad for him, so he took his wet socks, he put it by the fire, and then burned his socks. So then Pendergast had to make the rest of the trip with no socks. So that was just, one of those things, but you could see any 7-year-old doing that, right? And they're 10-year-old saying, oh, I'm going to dry these socks off for him. So it's a fascinating story. And they get to Hutchinson, and they find out that one of the original people that were here was gone, and they were on their way back from Minneapolis with supplies. Because even though Glencoe was there, they didn't have any supplies either, because they were still teeny. They were only a year old, right? So he goes into Minneapolis, and they wait for him to come back, and they're all still hungry. And he comes back for just enough food for the people who were already there. So almost immediately, that same guy and W.W. Pendergast head out on foot again back to Minneapolis to buy more supplies. And while they're gone, I think W.W. must have a little cash. So they buy a couple of oxen, and they buy a plow and a wagon, and they fill it full of supplies and bring that back. And now they at least have some subsistence to get started. And went out on the edge of town with those oxen and that plow and turned over some land and planted the very first crop right here in 1856, which immediately after it came up, the grasshoppers came along and ate. So they still didn't have any crops. But at least it was getting started. And then in 1856, we had our first 4th of July celebration. Nobody had anything to celebrate with or about, much less, except their freedom. So they decided to have a town-sanctioned bear hunt. And the reason that they did that is that they knew that there was a family of bears living a half-mile north of town. So they knew the hunt was going to be pretty easy. And they went up and shot a 400-pound bear a half-mile north of Hutchinson. Isn't that something? And brought the bear back and must have ate it. And it was shot just a half-mile away. The whole hunt took just a little over an hour. So they kind of knew, I think they picked an easy victory, but they probably needed a victory. And then that's how they celebrated the 4th of July. So that's pretty cool. So it's really humble. I think that that's one of the things that we all forget. The older we get, we probably are a little bit more, we think a little bit more about that. When you think about a lot of these folks, and not all of them were, not all of them were 15 or 18. There was just a lot of people in their, 40s to 60s, and we think about us in 40s and 60s and living in those conditions. It's amazing the tenacity that they had. So there's a list in his report, and he talks about the winter of 1857 and 1858. Now, by that time, there is what they call a gentleman's quarters, and it sounds like maybe it's like a dorm where workers are staying and whatnot. And he finds in their records their cost of living in the winter of 1857 and 1858 and what they went through. They went through 5.5 barrels of flour, and the total cost was $66. I don't know how much a barrel of flour would have been. Probably not a 55-gallon barrel, but probably a wooden keg. Maybe 15 or 20 gallons probably sounds maybe the right to me. 257 pounds of beef at a total cost of $25.70. 5 pounds of hamburger today. 7 bushels of potatoes, $7. That was simple. Cornmeal, 240 pounds, $9.60. Wow. 8 gallons of syrup for $8. Candy, 20 pounds of candy for $5. 2 bushels of beans. What kind of beans do you suppose they were? I have no idea. Would have been like green beans or like, it's hard to say. But 2 bushels, so we would assume dry, $4. Cream of tartar, ½ pound, 35 cents. Can anybody tell me what that is? I don't know. Would that be a form of?
Leavening agent.
Oh, okay.
Make something raise.
Okay. 12 pounds of rice, $1.56. 6 pepper papers, 60 cents. So a pepper paper. Would that be a wrapped pepper? I don't know. Interesting. You would think it would be dry, right? So maybe just pepper in a wrapped paper. 6 pounds of suet for $1. 3 pounds of butter for $1.05. Yeah. 15 pounds of buckwheat for 90 cents. 14 pounds of salt for 90 cents. And 3 pounds of soap for 45 cents. And 9 pounds of whatever that is. Let's see, make sure I didn't type that wrong. I'm going to make sure that I have that. And then we could speculate as to what it was. Saleratus. Yeah, saleratus. 9 pounds of SALERATUS. Google that. Whatever it was $1.46. Total cost per man $1.46. So total cost to feed 91 men for 3 months in the summer or the winter of 1857 to 1858. $133.46. Not bad. So interesting. I wonder what they were paying for room and board.
It's the main ingredient in baking powder.
Main ingredient in baking powder. So I suppose it was the, the cream of tartar was pre-yeast. Yeah, and then
Sometimes called potassium bicarbonate.
potassium bicarbonate's another name. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. All right. So there we were. Now in 1858, that was kind of a big year because that's when Lewis Harrington. So the very first sawmill was put in, they started building it in 1856, and we think it was put into service in 1857. Well, then they were kind of ahead of the game, because they could actually saw their lumber rather than use just logs, and that was kind of a big deal. They had, and one of the founders is the guy who was charged by the group to build the sawmill down by the river. It was then in 1858 that Lewis Harrington decided to build the Harrington Merrill, what we know now as the Harrington Merrill site. By the way, if you haven't been by there in the last few days, the barn is now painted, so that looks good. Yeah, it's an interesting color. It's a researched color, and we think it's real accurate as to what it originally was. So the barn is now painted, and the trim will go on, and there's a few doors to go on, but at least the exterior of that is completed now, and we can start working on the inside, which is kind of an extensive project. But if you think about it, the Harrington Merrill site was kind of like a northern version of a little plantation site, and now it's a little easier to see. So when you pull up in front of it, you see the house and the carriage house, and then the barn in the back, and you imagine that site sitting there all by itself, surrounded by fence with no houses obviously behind it, and then on the hill down to the water with the cattle and the horses grazing. And there were a lot of cattle and horses, and it was pretty exponential by the time, and the reason that we know that is by the time the 1862 uprising comes around, they refer to the hundreds of cattle and horses that are either stole or slaughtered in the uprising. So that was kind of their mark or their sense of wealth, if you will. So kind of important. So the Harrington Merrill site, and of course early pictures of the house, and that's pretty much what we restored it to. Its look in 1900, about the time of this report. That's what we had it for. So that was a big thing. This was a big thing because he was a surveyor. So this is where you would come to stake your claim. If you wanted to get that 80 acres from the government, you'd have to start here. And Mr. Harrington would take you out and actually show you where your 80 acres was and stake it out for you. And your family would stay here with Mrs. Harrington. And then the man of the house would go out and maybe make some type of a shelter, a small shelter, and then when he had that ready, he'd come back and get his family and take them out, and they would start their farming operation. It was also the site of the very first post office. Right on the end, when you look at the front of the Harrington Merrill house, it's the east driveway. Right on the end there was the little post office. And that's where the Pony Express would drop the mail. And that contract was given to 3 locals, and then they constantly brought the mail out. So in 1858, they had their first town meeting. That's when everybody came. And let's see, how many people showed up? Thought that was interesting, you know. It's starting to get a pulse. First town meeting was May 11th, 1858. 48 votes were cast. Not bad. You know, they're just 24 months into this deal. 4 townships voted at Hutchinson, and the north 2 casting 26 votes, and the south 22 votes. So, you know, you're starting to get a pulse. There's almost 100 people that are engaged in the growth of this. That's pretty good. And then, this is another one. In steamboat navigation, who knew? So in the spring and early summer of 1858, a steamboat, 20 by 60, pretty good size, was built to run the Hasson, Crow, and Mississippi rivers to Minneapolis. And it made the down trip without much trouble. So it came up and went down. That's a big vessel for what we think of as the Crow River now. And it went down, it came up, went down, never came back. The owners got a chance to sell it when they hit the Mississippi. Somebody liked it, and they bought it. And they abandoned it. They abandoned their enterprise and sold the boat. And it never came back. But a 60-foot boat, I mean, I was, you know, you think about a boat on the Crow now, to be able to navigate a 60-foot boat, that seems a lot. The water of the Hassan River was so high that a steamer could have run from Hutchinson to Minneapolis the first 5 years without difficulty. And then it changed. So about from 1855 to 1860, this river had a lot more horsepower, if you will. I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, the scarcity of food. So provisions were very scarce in the spring of 1858. Some families had lived through the winter only on potatoes and slippery elm bark. So the bark from young elm trees. Oh, wow. So there was no dominoes, right? But the middle of May found that Hassan was alive with buffalo fishes. The river was just full of buffalo fishes. Now, I don't know what a buffalo fish is, but is it a bullhead?
No, like a carp.
Like a carp, okay.
If you had ever been in Wilmer and saw the statue of Candy Ojai, his fish are buffalo fish.
Buffalo fish, okay, so like a carp, okay. And the marshes were just yellow with flowers of cowslips, so I think they could eat some of those. So for a while there was plenty of variety, and then those who were too lazy to pick greens just went fishing. That's what he says. And the fish could be boiled, or baked, or stewed, or fried. But whichever was chosen, I thought this was interesting. The flavoring was always the same. Pure Hassan river water. He mentions that also in the story where he swims out to get the goose, and then he talks about boils. And then the only seasoning we had was that pure Hassan river water. Now, I'm guessing he's being facetious and telling you it was pretty blah, unless there was really something special about the water. But I'm sure it was very clean, because there were no tile or anything feeding in, or sewer systems or anything feeding into the Crow River. And I'm sure it was extremely clean. So he said it took a connoisseur to decide which style of cooking had been adopted. Most of the people got their living in a way that may well be pronounced scaly. I don't know what that means, but that's in his notes, scaly. So maybe just making it, maybe, I don't know. The contract we talked about between Minneapolis and Hutchinson once a week was let to the Messrs, the Sumners, and Partial. His name is Partial. So the Sumners is a name that keeps coming up. They were kind of movers and shakers. They were here right from the very beginning. Little Perry Sumner was the first person to be buried in Oakland Cemetery. He was 6 or 7 years old. And his folks ran Sumner's store. And it was a general store. Next year we'll talk about how Mr. Sumner, when the town was under attack, offered any young man a new pair of work boots if they would sneak out during the uprising and bring provisions back to the stockade from his store. 12 people took him up on that. So they had 12 big bags of provisions that they were able to bring back from the store before it was burnt to the ground. Before it was burnt to the ground, the Sioux also helped themselves, and they took a lot of provisions. So they didn't just willy-nilly burn them down. They went at it pretty smart, and they cleaned the place out. But I thought that was, Pendergast, let's see. So they would carry the mail on their shoulders, and T.H. Pendergast's turn, I'm assuming that could be W.W.'s son, not sure. Came around almost every week, as he was the most willing and the best walker. So he could make the round trip to Minneapolis faster than everybody else. All right. Holy smokes. Yeah, I'm just going to run in here to Minneapolis. Interestingly enough, they called that little spot where you picked up the mail, and the Pony Express, when that came along, the station. And that is how they named our new newspaper, the Hutchinson Station. Through these stories, that term kept coming up, the Hutchinson Station. So you're getting your mail in, getting your news in. So that's a little. So the next time you pick up or you look out online and you see the Hutchinson Station, give that a little bit of thought, and because they did. And then we talked about the sawmill. Sawmill was important because they were able to start building, and that's pretty interesting. Now there are not a lot of pictures, actually, really none, of things before the uprising. And keep in mind that in the uprising, the whole town was burnt down, except for the Harrington, Maryland property and the stockade. They're the only two things that survived. Everything else, the whole town was burnt down. And but when you think about it, they were really some people of resilience because this is what Hutchinson looks like in 1876. So just 14 years later, it's starting to look like a town. That's really something when you think about it. Because now a lot of people would look at that and say, well, that's pretty humble village. Well, it is a pretty humble little village, but that's only 14 years old. That's a lot of buildings. There's a lot of people. I thought that was really interesting.
Is that looking north?
Yeah, I believe that is looking south. So I think if you see the I think this is where the bridge is, the main bridge. It would make sense because this would be where the lumber mill would be, next to the water. This would be Main Street. Yeah, 1876. Yeah. Interesting. When you think about Harrington, how they thought about their town. They really believed in their town. 1876. Look how wide Main Street is. It's a statement of how they felt about Hutchinson. You know, because most of the time, the Main Street was probably the same width as everything else. People just stepped it off. So, I thought this photo was very telling because of the timing of it and all the buildings, and then also, the width of that street, which really, really caught my eye. Because in the historic tour, when we come out from the Little Crow statue and start going up Main Street, we talk about the width of Main Street. The downside of that width is that the state of Minnesota thought it'd be a great place for a state highway. But just think how many towns had state highways through them and they didn't have that width to work with. We at least have that width to work with. So that's kind of interesting. That I didn't, it was kind of interesting because this little time is kind of wedged in, and we bring people back that experienced a lot of the growth of Hutchinson when we do our living history tours, but not very many people from that little time because it's only like 7 years, right? 1855 to 1862. But it was really where the pulse was started for the community. And I look at the numbers of that first town meeting, and that is really, truly a statement to the people. And that's probably one of the reasons why there was all of this other awesome stuff that was going on close to Hutchinson and continued to go close to Hutchinson. And we have just all, McLeod County, if you go out to the museum, just start looking at what was going on around Hutchinson. It was pretty amazing, We have the oldest, help me, Charlie. We have in Bisbee, we have the first creamery, co-op creamery in the nation, in Bisbee, Minnesota. Wow. Kaminsky School, the largest Bohemian library in the nation. In Kaminsky School. Guess what? It's all still out there on the shelves. So there are just some really cool things, and I think that although Hutchinson can't take total credit for that, might have been that attitude where people would show up and say, it's a good place to be. It's a good place to be. Silver Lake is a good place to be, but it's maybe just a little better place because it is relatively close to Hutchinson. So the railroads, the 3 railroads and all that stuff, which are stories where, this was the second little railroad, this one here that we're in, and that it was 1887. The first one was in 1886, and that's the one that ran from where Jefferson Street is and down to Glencoe. And then the last one that came was the loose line, the big one, that was running across the country. That little guy that ran between Hutchinson and Glencoe, he was the biggest thorn in everybody's side because he knew that the big guys were coming, and he beat them. He built his little railroad, and he signed up all of the freight contracts. And the big railroad was already going through Glencoe at the time, and the freight would be coming out. The big railroad, he signed up all the freight contracts for Hutchinson. And he started hauling that freight in those long-term contracts a year before this railroad started. And it took them decades to get those contracts away from him because he tied them up. He was a good businessman. Don't know who he was, but I like him. Okay, so we go for another 15 minutes, and but before we go into giving you some historic Hutchinson updates, any questions or anything you'd like us to research? Because we learn a lot from our guests, and that's one thing. Yes?
I'm fairly new to Hutchinson. Where was the stockade?
Oh, good question. So the stockade, it was north of the library, in Library Square, and it was 100 by 100, and it was basically across the street from the State Theater. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Everybody who made it to the stockade survived. There was not one fatality in the stockade. And I can just jump ahead a little bit. This is how next year's thing starts. So the Civil War is going on. So Lewis Harrington and about 12 or 15 other guys were all getting ready, and they were all saying goodbye to their families. Like, they were packed to go in and join the Union Army. They were just leaving when the uprising happened. And they looked at each other and they decided, well, if we go and fight this fight, when we come back, we're probably going to come back as widowers and to no town. So they disband their group and they notify the army that they're not coming. And their thought was, we'll gather up everybody and we'll leave. And we'll go to Fort Snelling. But there were 3 prominent women, Mrs. Harrington being one of them, who was a Pendergast. Her maiden name was Pendergast. And the girls pleaded with them to not do that. They said, let's stay here and let's fight. Let's build our own fort. And they convinced this guy who had some building knowledge to stay with them, and he directed the construction of the fort. And what they did was they dug a huge trench, and then they went out and found tree trunks, and cleaned them all off. And they used those trees that they had fell, and they stood them up side by side. So it was one continuous wall dug way down in the ground that came up, and that's how they built their fort. All right, so that's just a little preview next year. Yeah. So the women. So there's this a story about how the Merrill women and the Harrington women were extremely strong-willed women, and they were proud of their community. And it's interesting because the women had equal rights, and in this 28-page document, Pendergast never mentions women once, except for that those three women convinced them to stay. It's the only time he mentions women. So they could vote, but we're just not going to talk about it. Funny. Any good questions? Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Where did the name McLeod come from?
Martin McLeod was a well, I believe he was like a fur trader. I believe so. And he was a naturalist. And it was named after him. And let me see. You might even talk about this. But Martin McLeod. If you look him up, you'll find he has a fascinating story. And he was a frontiersman. And he was here, long before trading furs. And, those guys were movers and shakers in their own right. They knew how to make money, hauling furs back to the masses. But he was also a naturalist. We have a person in town who plays him and has researched him a lot, by the name of John Lothwell, and he is a member of a group that does historic weekends where they talk about how these fur traders were here before everybody else, and the impact they made. But Martin McLeod. Yes, there was another one over here. Another question. Yes.
How old was Mr. Harrington when he came here? Do you know about?
Yes, he was born in, he was about 30. Yeah, he was, I believe he was about 30.
And then there was a spot south of my direction's right, east of the river that was always called Pendergast Hill, between owns that now.
Yeah, and I think so, interestingly enough, he followed his dream. I don't know where, he must have had some cash. I mean, you read between the lines, like, this guy comes back with no provisions, I'm going. Well, he probably went because he could afford the oxen and the plow and the provisions, So he must have had a little money. He had liquidated his business by that time. It's a photography business, though, so I can't imagine how much it would have been worth. But I don't know where he came from back in New Hampshire, if he came from people with means. But apparently, you could either settle land, but then you could buy mass quantities of land from the government. And it was for like $4 an acre, $3 an acre. And he owned, like north of town, in a lot of their stories, they always talk about Hook Lake. They talk about Lake Hook. That was their playground. I was reading Lewis Harrington's 1882 daily calendar, which we have, which is amazing. And he makes note that Ellen and I spent the day on Lake Hook, at Lake Hook. So that's where they would go, I guess, to just hang out.
Pendergast, they had a home on the island on Lake Hook.
Yes, on the Big Island. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how old, like how far back that went, but I'm guessing that even WW had one, even though Norm's was not that old.
Yeah.
But I would guess WW's was. So anyway, interestingly enough, WW owned all of that farmland. So if you can visualize where Lake Hook is, he owned all that farmland from probably Clear Lake all the way over to the Kaminsky area. Okay, he owned all that farmland, and they sold all that farmland except the 2 islands, and then they stayed in the Pendergast name. until the big island is still owned by a descendant of the Pendergrass, and the small island is not. They sold it in 2017. And then I'm guessing the answer to your question is he owned all that land as well, to the east of town, probably connecting with that. And who knows, maybe all the way around the town. Because that was their game, right? Is to control the land. That was, and I'm assuming the more horsepower Hutchinson got, the more the land was worth. Right. Yes?
Did they ever say how long it took them to, back in that day, to make that trip from here to Minneapolis?
Well,
to get their supplies
Yeah,
and that?
a week. Yeah, so they would turn it around in a week. Yeah. I'm always amazed at how much they could travel with really no roads, just paths. I'm amazed at that. I mean, just think about a guy. Of course, I suppose if you have a good horse and you're traveling by yourself, but to decide that it must have been probably this time of year. Yeah, it was this time of year. It was in August that he met up with the Hutchinsons in Milwaukee, and yet they still were here by November with all 13 people. And he decided, I want to say it was like this time. It was like the 20th of August. He said, "It's too late. I'm going back." And then just like that, he's in Milwaukee. That's something. Yes, Jack.
Jim, I'm thinking of the townships around Hutchinson and their names. Hutchinson Township, Castle Valley, what the different ones. But did Pendergrass and that group have a part in setting those townships up and naming them?
That's a great question. You would think probably they would. Lynn Township, is probably an extension from the Hutchinsons because they were from Lynn, Massachusetts, and Lynn Road. Hassan Valley, Maple Leaf Valley, because of the Sioux. That's a really good question, Jack, that I don't know the answer to. I'll try to find that out. Because Acoma, does that sound like a Native American word? It could be. I don't know. That's a good question. Any other questions? All right, yes.
Well, a friend of mine, his dad was born in 1898, I think it was, and I used to listen to him tell stories, and they lived on the east side of Fallon Lake out there, and he said when they went into Hutch, with the horses and the wagon, that Highway 15 was just a little snake trail through the woods. He said you had to drive around the trees to get down the road. He says it was woods from Hutch all the way to Fallon Lake. That's as far as he ever went.
Okay. Yeah. Very thick. Interesting. Right on the edge of the Savannah Forest. Yeah. All right. Well, it has been our pleasure to be a part of the library presentations. You're all delightful. And you give off a lot of BTUs because the temperature's gone up 20 degrees. But at least you can hear, hopefully. We really enjoy doing this for you.